All right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I just wanted to hop on here and do a little reading in David's response to the Philistine victory. 2 Samuel 1:17 through 27 is the text. Um, the only part of the text that's mentioned in this book here, it says, David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. He ordained that the children of Judah should learn to use the bow, even as it is written in the book of the law. The excellence of Israel has been slain on the high places. How are the mighty fallen? Publish it not in the places of Gath. Announce it not in the region of Ascalon, for fear that the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, that the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. It says, we have already begun to see that even though Saul had cruelly persecuted him, that did not keep David from weeping and mourning his death. Thus, David showed that he did not have a vengeful spirit, and also that he had more concern and felt more deeply for the public good than for himself. David showed this by ordering the death of the man who brought the message that he had struck the final blow in Saul's death. Now, since we have dealt with this earlier, we need not search closely to know whether or not it was true. It is enough for us to know that the sentence that David pronounced on him was based on the testimony that he himself gave as his own judge, and that he was condemned by his own mouth. 2 Samuel 1:16. We all remember how this messenger from Amalek boasted that he had killed Saul, even though it was not true. But that is not important enough to make us investigate the matter. It is enough to observe that David had demonstrated that he was not Saul's enemy. Even though he had the opportunity to harm him along with the other men who had been pursued by Saul for such a long time, yet notice how he kept on doing him kindness. And as we have shown earlier, he was not found guilty of any crime. So much for this first point. Now, for the second point, David's zeal for the public good and safety of the people made him forget Saul's personal failings. Both these points are important, for there is a terrible corruption in vengeance, which is so deeply rooted in men that they think it is a virtue. They are proud of it and almost overcome by it. If someone has offered us, I'm sorry, if someone has offended us, we never let it slip our memory. We always resent it. If something bad happens to our enemies, it makes us rejoice. And when we have the chance to injure them and pay them back for their evil, it is very difficult for us to keep from doing so. We see then that this is a very common vice to which all men are inclined and in which far too many indulge. How carefully, therefore, should we notice what is revealed here about David? For when we are shown that uh, we, sh- for when we are shown that we should not be vindictive, we always come up with the excuse that we are not made of iron or steel, and that patience is quite contrary and repugnant to our nature, that it is impossible for us not to be hurt and thus motivated to harm our enemies. That may be so, but was not David a man subject to similar passions as ourselves? How then was he able to overcome the urge to take vengeance, since he too could have given so many good reasons? It is certain that he did not give way to his excessive passions, but chose to fight against them all the way, because the Spirit of God worked in him. Hence, let us learn to resist those emotions which incite us to evil, no matter how strongly we may be able to protest that those whom we hate and whom we wish to injure have assailed us without cause, and no matter how many excuses we can bring up, such as that we only sought peace and friendship, but that they would not allow us to be friends, let us not fail to keep ourselves strictly under control. When we are tempted to do evil, let us ask the Lord that it would please him to govern us by his Spirit, which is the Spirit of clemency, so that we will be purged of any bitterness or malice. and thus be able to practice what he says, quote, love your enemies and do good to them that persecute you, and pray God for those that curse you. Matthew 5:44 and Luke 6:27-28. It says, now this is so very repugnant to our natural inclinations that the papists have been so shameless as to measure the commands of God by what they find in themselves. Hence, they say this is only, quote unquote, a counsel. Since it is too difficult, they deemed it would be too rigorous as a straight command forever! Exclamation point. This certainly is dreadful blasphemy. It shows how far they are from reaching the goal of suppressing all feelings of vengeance, but that is not the way we are to act. We are not to obscure the commands of God in order to excuse ourselves. On the contrary, knowing very well that all vengeance is condemned by God, we must loathe it. And then, whenever we are tempted to give way, let us learn to run to God, who controlled his servant David and bestowed on him the grace of being able to stamp on those violent passions which could have moved him to hatred and bitterness towards Saul. This is the first point. Secondly, let us learn from David's example to seek the common good of those with whom we live, particularly since God grants us the grace of being his church, since he presides over us and dwells among us, and his name is honored. Let us seek, I say, to maintain and preserve peace in the community, so that our personal profit and loss holds no influence over us when it is a question of the public good. Thus, people should not just look after themselves, of course. If we say that this is very difficult, that is true. But David shows us the way. Insofar as he was a frail man like ourselves and did not lack feelings, he was in the same natural condition that we are in. Nevertheless, he put first things first. He put first things first rather than his own personal concerns! Exclamation point. They were nothing compared to the salvation and preservation of the church. That is why he mourned over Saul. This will seem strange at first glance, but it is certain that his blessing, I'm sorry, but it is certain that his burning zeal for the good of the church over which God had placed him as head made him forget everything else. So he fought against himself and submitted himself to the will of God in order to proclaim Saul's good characteristics, for his death made him indignant. As for the rest, there is no doubt that the lamentation recorded here was made to be published all over the country. So everyone would realize that David was not cut off from the people of Israel and would take him as a faithful member, recognizing that he had always pursued the welfare and safety of the people and was still seeking that goal. That is why it says that he ordained, quote, that the children of Judah should learn to use the bow. 2 Samuel 1:18. This has been explained in various ways. No one thinks that it means that they did not use the bow previously, for we can see that they did. Others have made one suggestion or another. However, it is easy to recall that David had composed this lamentation so that it would be spread all over the land. It was especially to encourage the children of Judah to practice shooting with the bow and to engage in military exercises so as not to lose courage after such a terrible defeat. The point is that this lamentation was linked with David's exhortation to the people always to be valiant. In other words, this is a sentence that is cut short. It says that David composed this lamentation over Saul and commanded people to teach the children of Judah to draw the bow. Here we have two things which at first glance do not agree. He seems to be comparing apples with oranges, as they say. But here we are shown that David had the same goal when he bore such solemn witness in his mourning over Saul and Jonathan as when he urged those of his nation to take courage and not despair or be too stunned by this defeat which had overthrown them. The text then adds that this was written in the book of the law, which no one takes to be the life of the patriarchs or the books of Moses. Probably there were many other books with fuller histories of these events, all of which would surely be useful for us today. Why then has God allowed such teaching to be lost, since it could have given us good instruction? Well, look at our laziness, and we will not be surprised! Exclamation point. Look at the books which do remain, which are the most essential to us, for they relate events in a brief, concise fashion. Matters are not drawn out at length, with the result that we do not have to occupy ourselves a great deal with them. Thus, it seems that God wishes to trace with his finger, as it were, how he chooses to govern his church for all time. As for the prophets, we do see terribly obscure sentences scattered throughout their books, but we do not worry about it. The words are thus to be explained by details which we draw from other scriptural language. This is just as important as finding some lost book. This shows us how inexcusable is our laziness in not applying ourselves to the study of these matters, so that the content of Scripture would be thoroughly familiar to us. So far, so good. One second. One second. There we go. So far, so good. Where am I putting my drink in? Oh, there it is. All right. This is page 20 of this book. So far, so good. All right. Yes, we seem to think we have done enough if we have just read a tenth of the scriptures in our whole life! Exclamation point. Yikes, shots fired. Seeing then how cold and listless we are in the study of the doctrine of God, we should not find it strange that he has removed many things which otherwise would have been useful to us, and that he has left us only what is necessary for our salvation. Anyway, we can easily gather that this lamentation of David was more fully stated and understood, and that there was a longer quotation of it elsewhere. It is sufficient for us to know that after David heard of the death of Saul, he sent this throughout the nation in order to rescue them from the trauma which had overtaken them, and to keep them from being conquered because they were scattered. For their enemies could have used the opportunity to press home their victory with further success, and so completely destroy the poor church of God. David, of course, was aware of that. So, in order to help the people understand the situation better, he sent them a hymn of lamentation. For if he had not done something, they could have been seriously alienated from him. For who would ever have judged these to have been his feelings? We are so used to, quote unquote, measuring others by our own yardstick, end quote, as we say. Well, then, here was David, who had been thrown down and banished by Saul's cruelty. He had wandered throughout the countryside among dangerous animals, in deserts and caves, and finally had been forced to flee to the country of the Philistines, the enemies of God. They were men who, for sheer pleasure, kept their swords drawn to kill anyone they could. They had already caused terrible butchery. The king and his sons were devoured by it. 1 Samuel 31, 2 and 6. It says, now, when David had fled from the country of Judah, everyone assumed that he would never return, for the king of the Philistines had given him a village, as we have seen, 1 Samuel 27, 5 and 6. After David had seen such a calamity strike his people and their enemies excited by blood, no one would ever have imagined that he would ever have rejoined the people of God at a time when they were so sorely afflicted that they seemed to have been rejected and abandoned by everyone. Moreover, since he had been received so kindly by the Philistine king Achis, no one would have thought that he would risk his neck or have the courage to rebuild the church of God. Rather, they could have conjectured that the opposite might easily have happened, since he had fought valiantly for such a long time for the people whom he had defended so many times against the Philistines, and yet they had not recognized what he had done for them as much as they should have. 1 Samuel 17, verse 18 and verse 19. There we go. It says, the Philistine victory could have given David a good excuse to live among the uncircumcised, where he would have had some rest. He could easily have said, quote, look at the people of Israel receiving the wages of their ingratitude, which they fully deserve! Exclamation point. God has avenged the trouble and injuries that they unjustly caused me. Now that could have been the way David felt, so that it was quite necessary for him to be touched to the quick by the Spirit of God. Yeah, it says so that he quick by the Spirit of God, so that he would willingly employ himself in his service as well as for the common good. He thus showed his true feelings, so that one could not hold him suspect nor think of him as a rebel, for he proclaimed the opposite in his hymn. To summarize, we can see now how the two things fit together. Why David composed this lamentation over Saul and also commanded that all over the country the children of Judah should learn to use the bow. In other words, learn to practice and prepare for war. Then, whatever evil might occur, they would never fail to resist their enemies, knowing that God would be their protector. That is what we must remember as the main lesson. Here is another point worthy of observation. David put himself forward in order to gain access to the opportunity to serve the common good of the people, however much it would be a risk to himself and expose him to so many troubles, as we will see later. Whenever we are able to plead the excuse that the means are not at hand, we are glad to retire far away from the action of the battle in order to avoid any annoyance or trouble. Let us suppose that it is our desire to expose ourselves to this or that difficulty, but the moment we see some obstacle, we say, I would very much like to do this, but it would put me into a dangerous situation. There are such obstacles here that I cannot do it. We think that these excuses will permit us to wash our hands of the matter, and that the whole world should absolve us. If we continue to do nothing and do not even try to see if we can do what God commands, we will easily be convicted. But we still do not fail to search for some kind of hiding place where we can avoid our duty. That is common human nature, which is all the more reason why we should observe what it says here about David. Even though he had the best will in the world to be used for the people of God, it certainly seemed that the door had been closed to him. Why? Because he was held to be the enemy of the true religion. The people distrusted him and hated him because of the ill will that Saul bore to him. That is how he could have excused himself before men and said, quote, whatever may happen, I cannot possibly be used for the salvation of this people. who have always resisted me, and I know that I will not be welcome no matter how much I may offer myself. So David had all these fine excuses, but that did not keep him from going to the people to encourage them to constancy and steadfastness. Furthermore, another possibility could have occurred to him, that he would not have been immediately received. They could also have accused him of dishonesty, saying, quote, "Oh, he is only putting on an act and making fun of us," end quote. Nevertheless, he went to his friends to show that no matter how much he had been unjustly afflicted and his life sought after, and no matter how much the people had offended him, nonetheless, he would never cease to be as friendly towards them as his own brothers. Dang. He showed this by the affection that he bore to Saul. It could have been said that hatred had been ended by death. This can be seen even among pagans and unbelievers, so that when you see that the person you hated is dead, then all the ill will that you bore to him is effaced. Effaced, effaced. But David had a different feeling, as we have already stated. Here, he shows us uh, that he had not changed in commitment or courage since the death of Saul. Rather, he declared that although Saul had been wrong to be his enemy, still he was not failing to carry out his duty to him. When David prayed to God and bore this testimony, it was not with any pretense or merely outward appearance, but with the kind of true affection which he felt for his brothers. Even before that, he had always sought Saul's welfare, no matter how much Saul molested him or was cruel to him. Even though Saul unleashed all his vengeance against him, David continued, I say, with the same affection that he demonstrated in this lamentation. Even though Saul had been like a lion with his mouth open to tear David in shreds, or like a bear with his paw ready to break him apart, in spite of it all, David grieved for him after his death. He still honored him as his king and desired to do him good as far as he could. And shout out to David for that. Shout out to David for that. That's hard. Let us come now to the substance of the hymn. The excellence of Israel has fallen and been killed on the high places. How are the mighty fallen? Psalm 2 Samuel 1:19. These words in David's song may make him seem very admirable, but if they literally indicate his true attitude, we conclude from his own viewpoint that his emotions were out of control. We see here, as though in a mirror, a man showing excessive grief with complete lack of self control. This teaches us that even though our grieving and our tears are for a good purpose and proceed from a good source, evil will still always be mixed in among our virtues. There will always be so many shadows and vices in our virtues that their existence should break down all our pride. So we will not boast, but will recognize that God will always find something amiss in everything that we do. No matter how blameless men may consider us to be, we will not fail to be. We will not fail to be condemned by God if he chooses to be strict. But actually, he supports us when we come to him without pretense, and he does not take into account the infirmities which are mixed in all parts of our life, for it pleases him to bury them. Thank you, Lord. This is what we must notice then in this lamentation of David's. For if he had been in complete control of himself, he would certainly not have employed the hyperbole that he has used here. Rather, he would have humbled himself before God and exhorted the people to repentance. Then after that, he would have made public prayers and encouraged them. But here he has produced the kind of lamentation which makes him look like someone who is lost! Exclamation point. He is not able to contain himself, and is, as it were, quote, dragging his wings, unquote. It seems like he even wishes to drown in his passion and make the people miserable as well. This should warn us that when we mourn, we must still keep in mind the church of God, so that we only mourn with the kind of good and holy zeal that God can approve. Yet often, if we are not on our guard, we are thrown into disorder, and our emotions carry us all over the place so that we do not keep to the straight and narrow path. We experience this all too often. For instance, when some dreadful calamity happens in the church, it is a good sign if we are moved by zeal. For it is written that, quote, the zeal of the house of God, end quote, ought to, quote unquote, eat us up. Psalm 69:9 and John 2:17. However, we may experience emotions that are so violent that they become excessive. Only with great difficulty will we be able to keep from gnashing our teeth and complaining against God. Quote, how could this possibly have happened? We cry. How could God allow such a terrible ruin and allow his church to be exposed as prey? And how could a good cause be beaten down like this? That is how we act, and we see the same thing in David, for he clearly recognized that God had chosen to punish Saul and all the people. Now, why should God allow the wicked to get the upper hand? Is it possible that his people could be abandoned and led to the slaughter? Thus, we see that this emotion which stirred him up was indeed excessive. Let us realize that we are similar. If such an excellent man, a true servant of God, endowed with such rare and unusual virtues, was subjected to this vice, how much more must we be on our guard? Exclamation point. Now, we may weep because of our true affection for God's name and our desire for him to be glorified, served and honored as he deserves, so that poor believers might be upheld. But even though we hold all these principles, when some adversity strikes us, it is still necessary to realize that we may utterly abandon ourselves and not hold on unless God sustains us. We must meditate beforehand so that we will not give way to an inordinate grief which can toss us about all over the place. This is a point which we must carefully observe. David addressed the words, quote, the excellence of Israel, end quote, to Saul. Although they could be said of the land, it would have been better for him to cry out and then address himself to the land afterwards. We know that when we mourn, we do not use sentences which flow with a continuous train of thought. Rather, we blurt out something in broken phrases. We mix in woes with what we want to say. For every word that is properly pronounced, there is immediately a sigh that nearly strangles us. And thus we are not able to say what we wanted to say. That is what we see in this hymn. David cried out, the excellence of Israel. The excellence of Israel, speaking of Saul. And then he said, speaking of the land, they have been killed on the high places. In other words, in a prominent place, as though someone had shamelessly built a scaffold so that it could not be hidden, placing it on a high mountain so that the spectacle could be clearly seen by everyone. When David thus called his enemy excellence, nobility, and desire, he used words that applied to Israel, just as he did when he praised Saul, attributing to him at the same time the praise of virtue and prowess. In this, he showed that he always prized the virtues which he recognized in Saul, no matter how full Saul had been of malice, rage, and stubbornness, just as though he was a wild animal. Saul must have been devil possessed, since he persecuted David like that when David was innocent. Now, this is what we have to observe. Although David saw that Saul was a man controlled by a satanic fury, like some desperate maniac, and that he was a rebel against God to the point of wanting to destroy what God had established. Yet he did not fail to contemplate the virtues and favors which God had granted him. This fact should be carefully observed, for it only takes a small vice to blind our eyes, so that all the virtues that God has put in a man are distorted. For instance, if a man is excellent at many things, if he serves the church of God and exhibits many exquisite qualities, in short, if he is worthy of being highly esteemed and honored, and yet has some little vice, that can be enough to disgust us so much that the good that the Lord has granted him is quite obscured. This is especially true when we are bearing a little envy or ill will. Then it takes nothing to make us blindfold our eyes to keep us from perceiving the grace of God, which is so evident in him. All the more, then, should we strive to follow David's example, because he could easily have used the corruption of Saul as an excuse to despise him and say, even if Saul had been an angel of God, he still resisted God's inviolable decree. Then he became worse than an unbeliever in that he was an enchanter and sorcerer, so he deserves no honor. David could have said that, and it was true with regard to Saul. But it was necessary for David to pay attention to something else, as it all also is for us. Even if our enemies are the most wicked in the world, God still does not want his grace to be overlooked. Thus, even when we even when we can say, quote, this person received grace from God but abused it terribly, end quote, and can legitimately plead this to be true, we must still value what came from God. For when we stamp underfoot and disdain the favors of God, we are not merely offending a mortal creature, but rather our ingratitude is against God himself. Moreover, let us beware that those who thus efface the memory of their enemies' virtues do a great wrong. Why? Because God gives us an opportunity to praise and esteem him when he bestows these favors on men, for they always serve some purpose, whatever it may be. I say that whatever wickedness there is in men, God clearly knows how to draw out the good that he has placed in them and use it for the welfare of his people. Indeed, no matter how much they may abuse it, we must still always contemplate the good so that we will commit ourselves to it. We must be alert to discern the favors which God has given to this person or that, even though they also have vices, so that we will be encouraged to do well. When we see that some people abuse and misuse the grace of God which they have received, we should be particularly willing to be instructed by it, as this is useful for us. Now, it is true that they are committing a sacrilege, and God will hold us responsible when we misuse his spirit in our vocation. He will hold us responsible for all that he declared for our salvation and which we abuse to our own ruin and perdition. Amen. Some good stuff. See, we've been on 33 minutes. Let's see, page 27. It says, we must gather this kind of instruction from the good which we see in our enemies and then apply it to our own advantage. Indeed, if we do blot it out, it is just as though we do not deign to subject ourselves to obedience to God, or that we pretend that the malice in men can hide and bury the good. So let us strive to follow the example of David and prize the favors of God wherever they are found, however much we are bitten and infected with venom, so that we feel bitterness of heart against our enemies. Let us still begin to recognize the good that God has put in those whom we hate, so that we can retrieve ourselves and correct our bitterness. That's big time. That's crazy. It says, however much we are bitten and infected with venom, so that we feel bitterness of heart against our enemies, let us still begin to recognize the good that God has put in those we hate, so that we can retrieve ourselves and correct our bitterness. Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. All right, look, I'm gonna pause it right there. Let me see if I can pause. Okay, I can't pause, but I'm gonna go ahead and catch out. I'll come back a little bit later. All right. All right. Thanks for tuning in.